Hello, everyone, and welcome to our final Fruit for Thought for 2025. My name is Tegan Davies. I'm the Head of Programs here at Be Well Co. Look at you, so many people dialing in on time. If you don't know much about us, I'll tell you a little bit about us in a little while, but I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that we all dial in on from today. I'm coming in from the beautiful NRMA, slightly overcast today, Melbourne. And I'd like to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise how beautifully they have looked after the lands that we are all in, dialing in from for 60 odd thousand years. Thank you for dialing in. If you know your traditional owners and you'd like to share where you're coming from today, it would be amazing to have an interactive session. There'll be opportunities for you to ask questions of our incredible panellists as well. We're here to talk about this incredibly important topic of diversity and inclusion, and why we might be in this space of fatigue in this area, and what we might be able to do about it now and also into the future. So the good news is I know there's quite a few folks who are new to us today. For those who don't know about Be Well Co, we really love to research mental health and wellbeing and take our research and research of other world leaders and translate that into actually evidence-based, really practical workshops and programs that enable our clients to operate at their best through employee wellbeing. So this topic today, also technically, for those who don't know, we're also Camp Quality Social Enterprise. So the good news is when you purchase from us, you're also supporting kids with cancer. I forgot about our main purpose as an organisation. So today, this idea of diversity and inclusion, and I wanted to welcome our esteemed speakers here for you today. The first one I wanted to welcome was Catherine Hunter. And Catherine is the CEO of Diversity Council Australia. Before joining DCA, she also spent senior roles in Woolworths Group as well as KPMG. And in 2014 was recognised for her incredible reconciliation work with the Human Rights Business Award. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you, Tegan, and hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here, and I'm dialing in from beautiful Wongal land, and I would like to just pay my respects and honour the ancestors who've cared for this country for millennia as well. Lovely to see you all.
Thank you, Catherine. And the sun looks like it's shining. The next speaker we have today is Courtney Pond. Courtney is the Group Head of Diversity and Inclusion at NRMA. That is my dyslexia out there in public, NRMA. Before NRMA, she spent lots of time in organisations that are quite complex and diverse, including Officeworks, and she's also a RE member, the HR Institute, and is really mentoring the next generation of HR practitioners. So thank you, Courtney.
Thanks so much for having me, Tegan. I'm joining from gorgeous Darra country and would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and any First Nations people who are joining our session today as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Courtney. Last but not least, the wonderful Cherie Clonan. Welcome, welcome. Cherie is the CEO of a digital marketing agency called Digital Picnic. She is a proudly autistic CEO and a total legend in the space of inclusion. She's been awarded and recognised as B&T Women of the Year, as well as Women Breaking Glass Ceilings Award. I think I've screwed up the title, but basically, in essence, kicking bum in the women's leadership space. I really welcome Cherie as well. Thank you, Cherie.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm here from Wurundjeri land. It's an honour to be here.
Beautiful. Hey, let's start with Catherine. In your role at DCA, this strategic pillar in diversity and inclusion in Australia, I'm curious to understand your perspective. Obviously, we're in this space of some pushback, maybe some fatigue. I suspect most people understand that there's a changing dialogue in the D&I space, but I'm really curious to understand, in your experience, what you think might be at play here, and why we should even care about D&I.
Yeah, thanks, Tegan. So look, there's a lot in that, but if I can maybe try and summarise, and I stepped into the role as CEO in March, so still relatively new. And that was really just in the new year. I don't think any of us could have avoided the incredible backlash that we were seeing from the US from, I'm not going to mention his name, but, you know, D&I was being blamed and diversity hires were being blamed for everything from the LA fires to the Washington plane crash. So whilst I'm really pleased to say that we're a member-based organisation representing about 1,300 members from workplaces across Australia, I was really pleased to see many of our members saying that they were doubling down. However, for those who do have US offices, it was impossible not to feel the impacts of D&I, and many organisations were having to actually remove references to diversity and inclusion from their websites and the like. So I think we saw not quite a backlash to the same degree in Australia, but we certainly saw and have seen some growing resistance even to things like gender equity. Coupled with that, I think we saw the demonising of certain groups such as migrants and the LGBTQ+, particularly the trans community in the US, and that certainly, again, has had a flow-on effect here in Australia. Post-referendum, we're also seeing, I think, people feeling emboldened to say things that are more racist and discriminatory, and Reconciliation Australia's latest barometer has shown evidence of that. First Nations people are experiencing increased incidences of racism. And we just have to look at the recent rallies, which are sort of anti-immigration rallies really in Australia as well, in Victoria and New South Wales. So an increasing polarisation of the society and community, coupled with that sort of backlash to diversity and inclusion and resistance, and I think an emboldening of people to say things that they perhaps previously hadn't said, add a cost of living crisis to that as well, where I think people's mental bandwidth is really stretched, and understandably people are focused on paying their rent, their mortgage, their bills, electricity prices, grocery prices, all of those things. We have a perfect storm where in many ways it's never been easier to sort of step away from the very sort of foundational elements of diversity and inclusion, which is really, when it comes down to it, respect and kindness for your fellow human being. So look, I'll pause there. There's certainly happy to talk at some point in this webinar about the many benefits and why it's so important to continue with D&I. But I do think we're experiencing a bit of fatigue around the focus on diversity and inclusion. And I do want to say to all the people on this call that might be D&I practitioners, thank you for the incredibly hard work that you do. I worked, my last role was for 3 years as a D&I practitioner in the largest workplace in Australia and New Zealand. And when you are constantly challenging the status quo, when you are constantly trying to represent the voices of those who aren't in the room, or you yourself have that lived experience, it is exhausting hard work, and it can feel very lonely. And so I just want to thank you and commend you, because it's a tough space. We know the burnout rate is sort of 18 months to 2 years in most D&I roles. So hang in there, you're not alone, and the work that you do is so incredibly important.
Oh, absolutely, Catherine. Such a beautiful recognition of people doing really important work on the ground. And I think a lot of the folks who are dialing in today are also not in D&I roles. They're actually leaders interested in health and well-being of their people. And they too can also feel like they're up against some systems or organizational cultures that can make their roles quite challenging as well. We might share some burnout tips later on in a follow-up session for those who are dialing in, because it's hard work sometimes to always have to speak up, particularly if it's not a psychologically safe workplace. And I suspect at some point we'll talk a little bit about psychological safety, because I think it's really, really crucial for us to create that cultural change. So on the back of that, Courtney, I'm kind of interested in this idea. And coming off the back of Are You OK Day, I know that's not technically a direct, well, no, it is. It's a mental health inclusion side of things. But sometimes we see organisations do things like Are You OK Day or Wear It Purple Day, and it feels a bit tick boxy in that it's their comms team leading it rather than maybe their D&I or HR practitioners. And maybe that's kind of all they're really doing. I'm curious to explore, do you feel like that's happening on the ground? And do you think that is one of the reasons why there's an exhaustion, because it feels inauthentic?
I think it's a great question. And I think, look, it's undeniable that a lot of the fatigue you do see around DEI is because it's being delivered as a tick box, I think. But what the deeper issue is that it damages psychological safety, which you kind of just touched on as well. I think when inclusion feels superficial or inconsistent with lived experience, employees feel unsafe to speak up about the real issues, and that lack of trust is a psychosocial risk. So I think, particularly, if I'm talking to the big organization perspective, psychological safety is built when people feel heard, respected, protected from negative consequences, about being honest about their lived experience. And so I think tick box DEI really undermines that. If people see one-off campaigns, if they see cupcakes and colourful posters and a 1-hour workshop, but those underlying behaviours and systems or those leadership norms don't shift, the message that their people receive is, we talk about inclusion, but we don't act on it. And I think that gap itself becomes a psychosocial hazard. I think it creates uncertainty and frustration and real disengagement. And I think the result of that is almost like an emotional dissonance. Employees want to believe in their organisation's values, but their lived experience doesn't align with it. And over time, I really think that disconnect kind of erodes that sense of safety, and people stop believing that if they talk about their lived experience, if they raise an issue, that it leads to anything meaningful. And when people, start to feel unsafe to speak up, the organisation loses those early signs of harm, whether that's around discrimination or exclusion or bullying or poor leadership, until those issues really escalate. And so I almost think that fatigue in that context isn't necessarily resistance, it's almost self-protection in a way. And I think, if you contrast that when DEI is integrated into the fabric of an organisation, whether that's into role design or workload management or leadership accountability and performance, it actively reduces those psychosocial risks. People see consistent behaviours, fair processes, they see leaders modelling respect and accountability, and then I think they feel safer contributing, challenging and being themselves. And then I think what you start to see is that, fatigue becomes enthusiasm and energy and engagement. And so I think inclusion is something you need to do all year round. It's not something we talk about occasionally. And you really need to make sure that, it's fundamental to thinking about your engagement, retention strategies and your overall well-being in an organisation.
Wow, 2 hard-hitting, straight-up things that I've written a bunch of notes already to circle back on. I'm really curious around the interplay of like the systems you put in place and then how leaders show up, because you can have the best policies and processes, but if your leaders don't believe in it, or maybe they do believe it and they just kind of fumble constantly, that can be absolutely detrimental. And I love that you've talked about psychosocial risks and hazards, and how psychological safety is the only way you can know what risks are there. Because if people don't feel safe speaking up, you've got risks everywhere, and you have no idea.
Yeah.
Exactly. So off the back of this, I'd love to get Cherie view on something that I've kind of been mulling over for a little while, and I'm going to sound a little bit controversial here. In the family conversations, in my family, sometimes I found some frustration points, and I'm curious to understand, are we super precious at the moment? And I say this with love. Are we being too offended by every comment that everyone says, even if it's not malicious and it's not intended to be a negative comment? Are we creating an environment where everyone's just stepping on eggshells and so afraid to say the wrong word that actually we're not really creating a very psychologically safe place for anyone, because we're all worried about hurting other people's feelings? What are your thoughts on that? I'm dropping the bombshell on you straight up, Cherie.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's an interesting one for me, because I was, just before today's session kicked off, I sort of did proudly say I consider myself a really unoffendable human. So I honestly really just do prefer to save my offense for the stuff that genuinely matters. And And I think there's a lot that I can genuinely be offended by this year, starting with Tylenol. As an autistic woman, I can't tell you how much that offended me to my core. So honestly, I prefer to save my offense for the stuff that matters. And what I would say to you, Tegan, and anyone who's interested in this question is, where I've landed is making sure I'm always asking myself questions around, am I actually feeling just discomfort at the moment? So maybe psychological discomfort. Or is this genuinely psychologically unsafe? Because there is a really big difference. And if we think about a triangle, for example, that I've been shown by multiple leadership consultants who've, walked into my workplace, for example, we as a workplace are committed to always in this particular triangle hanging out in a growth zone where we can, where it's possible, and not a comfort zone. So if we're scared to offend 24/7, we don't give ourselves the opportunity to be stretched and head towards, that growth zone, So I can remember many years back first being diagnosed as an autistic woman after my son, which is a very typical pathway for autistic mothers who've been raised in autistic families where every autistic trait is just normalized. So we just don't know that this is not the run-of-the-mill experience. I sat in 12 months of silence first before I spoke, because I wanted to make sure that by the time I did speak, I got it right with language, because I recognized that I'm a woman with a small degree of influence thanks to my little pocket of the internet. And I wanted to make sure that the words I used were right and not ableist, or, certainly not in the first 12 months sitting in that internalized ableism that we can sit in immediately following diagnosis and so on. And so by the time I came out, I felt like I was coming out and being a safe contributor to the conversation. So I say to anyone as well, if you are feeling a little uncomfortable, just sit in short-term silence, for a little bit. That's in my mind, like a bit of a leadership move. But when you're ready to talk, absolutely talk. And if someone educates you in a moment because you used a particular word that you just weren't aware that had implications because XYZ, then someone will tell you, every single week at the Digital Picnic, so the company that I own, with a largely neurodivergent workforce, I will just quietly pull someone aside and say, hey, probably prefer not to use the word lame because ... And then I'll go into some really gentle education on, that particular word and how it can harm particular, groups. And it's a 2-minute conversation, and it's just, thank you so much. Didn't know, now I know, now I can be better. So psychological discomfort or psychologically unsafe, there is a very big difference. When we're uncomfortable, we get to grow the very most. So make sure you know the difference between discomfort and lack of safety, because there really is a big difference.
Totally agree. And I know a lot of organizations are having that conversation with people more broadly, even in terms of performance management, and how people are now saying that they don't feel safe in performance management because they're being made to feel uncomfortable. And you're so right that and in fact, the only way organizations like yours can be in that creative growth zone is if it's psychologically safe to start with. If you don't have that as a pillar, no one's going to feel courageous enough to make mistakes, because that's going to happen, right? And to enable your team to feel comfortable in mistakes is beautiful, and not every organization provides that space or teams. What kind of struck me about your answer, Cherie, is just a level of kindness that I can hear when you're having those uncomfortable conversations. Because I've certainly been in conversations where I've had my incredibly diverse friendship group, and I'm very lucky to be in a very diverse friendship group, sometimes be, and I'll say this, a little bit aggressive when people have said the wrong words. And I can hear in you that there's this calmness of, like, someone didn't mean to say the wrong words. They just maybe didn't know that lame was something that might be offensive to some people. And so I'm curious, just with Catherine and Courtney, is there anything that's coming to mind with you? Because we've kind of covered some gold nuggets already. Anything that pops up based on what we've just been talking about?
Yeah, I think that's a great question to ask. we're certainly seeing, even amongst people in workplaces that might be executive sponsors, that people are genuinely, people who care are genuinely worried about saying the same thing. So their default is to not say anything. And I love, Cherie, that, you know, you're taking the time to get it right and not reacting to sort of want to be, you know, always be that champion is so important, because language is so important. However, I think what we're seeing in this year, particularly on the back of a previous year, where anytime a leader spoke out, they were being attacked for virtue signaling, or a company who took a position on a particular issue, particularly during the referendum, was being woke. It really created then a sense of leaders speaking out that was unsafe for them to do so. And so, unfortunately, the reaction there is that people have gone quiet, and people in workplaces who might identify as marginalised are feeling that they've been a little bit abandoned and forgotten by leaders, because they're not hearing that vocal support or seeing the visible support, because people are worried to do or say the wrong thing, or they're concerned about being attacked for doing so. So it is something that we really need to, and Cherie, you gave a lovely example where you address the person privately and in a gracious way. And I think there is a bit of a movement as well towards people wanting to demand that allies be more vocal. And part of me gets that, but actually I've seen really great allies be sort of reprimanded for getting it wrong or being told they're not doing enough. And so, you know, my approach is that we need to be wrapping our arms around anyone at this point who's going to be an ally, whether it's a little bit more performative than we'd like. Nonetheless, I think anyone who is willing to step up and be, you know, stand up for others, we should be encouraging and thanking. And, you know, that once we do that in a way that brings them into the tent, they will, I think, be willing to do more and step up with that guidance that's given in a gracious, kind way, so as not to sort of embarrass people. I love that idea that we do need to get comfortable being uncomfortable. We do need to stretch ourselves. And some of the resistance, I think it's helpful to us to remember as well, is that resistance means that we're making progress. Anytime there is change, you will feel that sort of pushback from certain elements. So if we can take any heart in that, it's perhaps that we are making progress.
Yeah, that's a new, if that's not already. I've just written that down. Trademark that, Catherine, as a bumper sticker. Sorry, Cherie, go for it. I just cut you off.
No, that was Courtney. Yeah.
No, that's okay. I agree wholeheartedly with both Cherie and Catherine. I think what I always say to people too, one of the challenges I found as a DEI practitioner is DEI doesn't have to be adversarial. You know, you don't have to pick it, you know, like it doesn't always have to be an argument. You know, we need to create space for people to learn, and I think give people grace, and it's okay not to have all the answers. I, as a DI practitioner, don't have all the answers, and this idea that it has to be a fight, and there's all this idea that inclusion and belonging are a finite resource, and if we give some to one group and there's none left for another group, is hugely problematic, because it's not the case. And so I think really working to dispel some of that thinking is critical too. This idea that, you know, if we're being inclusive of someone else, then that takes away from another group, when in actuality, being inclusive for one group absolutely opens up opportunity and support for everyone. And so that's something that I always really try to emphasize with the groups that I work with, that this is beneficial for all and there's no finite resource here.
Oh, I love that concept of the fact that there's a piece of the pie for everyone, and it needs to be, because there's so much intersectionality of our diverse characteristics. In fact, when you were talking, I was reminded of the fact that on paper we might not look like the most diverse group of people speaking about diversity and inclusion, and I recognize that. I'm sure there are a few people that looked at the image and went, they all look like they're female, and they all look potentially like they're Caucasian, and they all look like they're able, but there is some intersectionality in our characteristics that might not necessarily always be seen. But I am conscious that probably someone is thinking, well, hang on, where's the man here? Straight up, which is interesting, because I too put this panel together and have ruminated for the past 2 weeks that we haven't had the silent tick box or the silent requirement that if you have a panel of 3, you'll need to have at least one male or one female or one gender diverse person. So I'm really curious again. I want to have the hard conversation here, given I've put this panel together. I'm curious about understanding your thoughts on quotas, whether they're invisibly unspoken quotas or whether they are hard-written, KPI-driven quotas. What are your thoughts on it? And are they beneficial? Are they detrimental? Yeah, I'm open to anyone having a go at this pretty hard-hitting question.
I could speak, I guess, a little bit to this, but I'll take it away from a professional setting first and just say what I know to be true is the most dangerous setting is the one that looks, feels, and sounds the same. So that super homogenous setting. And for us as a family, my husband and I, raising 2 autistic kids, I can say that the most dangerous setting our kids have ever been in was an almost all Anglo school. And the minute we decided this is unsafe, and they were having a really hard time at this particular school, we moved to a school in Melbourne CBD, so incredibly diverse, and the safety was felt immediately. So what I've known since that day, and I knew it anyway, I've grown up in an Anglo-Indigenous home. I know exactly what life is meant to look, feel, and sound like, and subsequently feel like. I live in multicultural Melbourne, so I also know what this city at a bare minimum is meant to look like, and once we got to that different school, it was just immediate safety. And so for us here today in this conversation, I think we need to make sure that without being at all obviously tokenistic or ticking boxes and anything performative, I know that's not what anyone here is, at all trying to, do today. I just think that we have to look around and make sure that our workplaces look, feel, and sound like the world that we live in, so that we can get the lived experiences of multiple different people and benefit from that. So only last month I met with the team from Uber who wanted to hear how an autistic person navigates the app. And in that conversation, I told them, have you heard of a neurodivergent tax? It's where we are, unfortunately, having to sometimes pay about 30% more, just because for me, I find it incredibly overwhelming to walk into a supermarket, the fluorescent lights, the sounds, the way they change the aisles at a moment's notice, and suddenly you finally had that routine locked down and you just can't figure out where the baked beans are anymore, and so on. And so, yes, I recognise that there's a privileged angle to this, but I do take about 20% more on occasion to save my spoons, as we call it in autism land, and just do a small little shop on Uber Eats. And they had never heard of that concept, but they couldn't, because they hadn't heard from an autistic voice with regards to just some of the surprising benefits of the app, for example. So I just think, yeah, without being tokenistic, let's collect an entirely different set of lived experiences so that we all benefit and have those moments where we're like, I didn't know that I didn't even know this. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Cherie. Catherine, I know you unmuted too.
Yeah, look, I think that was just beautifully said, Cherie. We were talking earlier about the vital importance of different diverse voices and perspectives in the design of apps and policy and services and products to get a much richer and better outcome that actually suits a far bigger range of people. But I think to come back to your question about targets and quotas, I'm a supporter of absolutely targets. If quotas is too far a step, and sometimes quotas can unfortunately drive the wrong behaviours, but certainly targets that are measured, and if they're not met, the explanation as to why not. I think we look at history, it's really the only thing that has driven change. If we look at what's happened in countries before Australia around gender targets, it's really the only thing that's moved the dial on an issue such as gender. And and we really, if we're going to want to achieve greater representation, particularly on boards, and at senior levels of organisations where, let's face it, the power is held because that's where the influence and decisions are made, then I do think setting targets at a minimum and potentially quotas is something that we need to look at, because as I say, it's proven to be effective. And in a world where, there's so many things coming at businesses, increased legislation is wonderful in some of the areas that we talk about in diversity and inclusion, but it does force a prioritisation. And so if other elements aren't legislated in terms of representation, then it then falls back to organisations themselves to set those targets to achieve greater diverse representation at senior levels.
Great, thank you, Catherine. Courtney, is there anything you want to add for quotas and targets?
Yeah, I mean, it's the controversial topic. I think it's important to keep in mind that you can utilise quotas or targets as a lever, but they can't be a crutch. I think, quotas or targets aren't really meaningful or impactful if they're not kind of paired with leadership, accountability, inclusive culture programs, equitable recruitment promotion, and active sponsorship, I think, of underrepresented talent. And I think too, a big part of, I think, the debate around quotas versus targets or both is that importance of communication and transparency. I think where you see organisations do it well is they're clear about the why behind a target or a quota, and that, it's about creating equity of opportunity and removing systemic barriers. And I think framing them really as a tool for fairness and future-proofing drives stronger buy-in, I think, in a lot of organisations. And for me too, I think it's about measurement beyond representation. So not just tracking who is present, but who's progressing, who's being given the opportunity to actually speak or lead or influence. And so that's where I think pairing quotas or targets with inclusion and engagement and retention and kind of psychological safety data to assess real progress is really critical as well.
I love that sentiment. And when you were talking, I was reflected on a concept in psychological safety called conversational equality. And when I first heard that term, it blew my mind. As a pretty loud extrovert who's not afraid to speak up in most situations, sometimes I am, it made me realize how many voices we weren't hearing even at Be Wellco, in our teams. Some folk are more extroverted and some are a little more introverted, and some like to speak up and some don't. And for me, I now literally at the back of my head in a meeting, I'll try to not say stuff first, and then I'll be like, okay, has everyone had a voice? And that, I think, is a really small way to show up, but one that, particularly as someone who speaks a lot, I hope has helped me create a space that is more equal in hearing other people's thoughts. So I love that you've sort of brought that psych safety lens in. I'm conscious we've got like 10 minutes left. I cannot believe it already. 45 minutes is just never enough. We do have a question that's come through, and so what I'd like to do is, if you have other questions, please feel free to either write them in the chat or in the Q&A section. So Cherie, I'll let you know the question is around the three zones in your triangle. But once we sort of get to that, we'll then move to, like, what can we do? What are some practical things we can do, whether a D&I practitioner, a senior leader, or someone in the middle, some where we've seen it work well, and also what we can do about it. But Cherie, do you want to share your triangle?
Yeah, sure. Okay. I love this triangle. So literally visualize the triangle, and at the top of the triangle is the growth zone, which is where we all obviously want to be. You wouldn't be here today if you didn't have a growth mindset, honestly. Down in the bottom right is a comfort zone. And that's where sometimes just organizations can naturally drift, even because of some of the themes around what we've been discussing today of, Catherine identifying people, well-intended allies, feeling like they have to sort of close up a little bit and opt to the comfort zone out of safety. For example, that was a really great example of choosing the comfort zone for just, safety related reasons. I understand that. In the bottom left is the burnout zone. So that's the one we really want to avoid, especially when I heard about the was it 12 to 18 months, move on statistics. That's huge. I've not heard that statistic before. And so, yeah, it's just identifying what can lead to that burnout zone and obviously trying our very best to avoid anyone heading there. So, you know, for me as my company's organizational leader, I really make sure that I we normalize conversations around what is growth zone and what is comfort zone. And I also accept when people have, you know, dialed into the comfort zone for safety.
Yeah, the comfort zone is actually not in and of itself a bad thing. In fact, you can't stay in growth zone the whole time, right? And so to sit in some safety, regroup, particularly if we're in teams where there's a lot of pressure, and of course agency life, there are demands that need to be met. So comfort zone, I think, is actually okay. We know that high performance athletes have recovery as built into their system of high performance. So we'll share some burnout stuff. We've talked about it a couple of times. I'll share that with everyone post session. But we've had a question that I think we can answer at the same time as answering like when we've heard when this has worked really well. So the question is, how do we make diversity and inclusion something that everyone plays a part in? How do we create those systems so it's not just the D&I function or the HR function? So maybe Cherie, we might just get your view first as the CEO of an organization. What are some things that have worked well, and how do you create that approach across your whole organization?
Yes, can you just give me the last part of that sentence? I've very embarrassingly shared in the chat that my Labrador kicked the modem. I'm back, I'm good. Rosie's in trouble. I apologize all. I can't believe this has just happened. Just the last part I just missed.
Well, actually, I spoke very fast. And so I also realized that was not a very inclusive way to speak. So I will slow down. And my question is, so how do you create systems at work to create diverse and inclusive workplace? What are some things that you've done, or maybe you've seen others do? And then the other part is, how do we make sure it's not just D&I or HR leading this?
Yeah, to be really honest with you, we've made sure that we've headed to a spot as a company that has as many different people with different, you know, sets of lived experiences designing those policies. I recognise, being an indie agency owner here in Melbourne, that I don't have the full, you know, support that I crave at this point in my business journey. And so we need to create it ourselves. And in order to do that, in order to make sure that it is safe, we benefit from having people, you know, combine forces and different sets of lived experiences to design the policies accordingly. We also make sure that anyone who's hopping into a leadership role is given the very necessary training that they deserve in a workplace like ours. We have to set them up for success and safety. And then, of course, something that my organisation really benefits from is the lived experience of an autistic CEO. So there are things that we normalise at our workplace that other people have never heard of. You know, so I was talking before this webinar kicked off about circadian rhythms and how we've designed our work schedules around circadian rhythms. So neurodivergent brains are very active at different times in the day. And some neurodivergent brains don't turn off until 2 o'clock in the morning. So a 9 a.m. start for a brain like that one, you're not going to have that team member on your team for anything more than 6 months. Honestly, I just know it. I've seen the statistics. And so for that reason, I introduced concepts like that to my team when they'd never heard of that, especially our leadership team. And that person is one example who starts at 11 a.m. instead of 9. Has been with us for 7+ years now. When she had moved on from each role at every 6-month point, she just needed to avoid the 9 a.m. start. And so, yeah, for us, it's having people just normalize conversations around where they can, you know, lend that area of lived experience or expertise, and then guiding policies accordingly. We don't have to overthink everything, to be so honest with you. Yeah.
Yeah, we tend to make things more complex than we do. And Cherie, you've got so many amazing little policies that, I mean, we could spend an hour just speaking to you around what you've managed to achieve in your organisation. I'm curious, Courtney and Catherine, what things have you seen work well, whether it's in your organisations or in others in this space?
I'm just going to say everything that Cherie said, and there's also a great comment in the chat that I'll let everyone read. Thank you for that. So look, I think absolutely setting lived experience, but if we are reflecting on our own privilege is something that's really important. Are we as an individual unintentionally excluding others without meaning to, that sense of conversational equality where you ask everyone, as long as it's not putting someone on the spot, it's not making them feel uncomfortable, inviting people's thoughts and comments if you haven't heard from them in the meeting. But it starts too before we even enter the workplace with looking at our job ads. Are they inclusive? Is the recruitment process inclusive? Is the onboarding process inclusive? Are the teams ready and prepared? And is their disability confidence at a certain level, their cultural competency at a certain level, that they're going to be welcoming of people from diverse backgrounds? So I think, there's too much to say in a few minutes, and I want to give Courtney a chance to contribute, but think about your own, the way you show up as a person in an organisation, and then also think about every step of the process when you're actually looking to hire and bring new people into your workplace, because we've got lots of guides, some of them are behind the member paywall, but there's so much on the DCA website if you want to actually look at inclusive recruitment and all the other things, AI and inclusion in AI, lots and lots of more tools there, because there's too much to cover here.
Yeah.
Bless you, Catherine. Look at that equality of conversation right there. We'll provide a link to the DCA website after this session as well. Thank you. Courtney?
I would absolutely wholeheartedly agree with everything Catherine and Cherie have said. I would also add specifically around that piece of how do you make DI not just something that HR or your DI manager are responsible for, is building leadership capability, not just awareness. So one of the things in the last 12 months, we've started running, myself and a colleague in organisational development, we've started running an inclusive and empowering leadership series for leaders in our organisation. And those sessions are co-facilitated by members of our employee resource group, so they can share their lived experience, whether it's of a culturally diverse background or disability, or LGBTQI+ community. And the things that we talk about and where we look to develop skills, not just knowledge for our leaders, is how do you interrupt bias? How do you create psychological safety? How do you lead diverse teams and have courageous conversations, or manage, conflict or microaggressions? And I think particularly in large organisations such as ours, leaders shape so much of that employee experience. So leadership behaviour is your biggest lever for reducing psychosocial risk and building trust and creating that sense of belonging. So if that was one thing that I would add to what Catherine and Cherie have also said, it would definitely be that.
Yeah, we know particularly middle leaders are core in that, because as I said earlier, you can have the best policies and processes, but if your middle leaders or leaders in general just don't really understand their impact, you're going to have the same outcomes over and over again. Do a fair bit of work in psychological safety as well as psychosocial risks and hazards. And one of the things that we encourage leaders to do and have the skill set for is to be upstanders, not bystanders. And that's, insert swear word, really hard, because we're meant to be in packs, and if we've always lived in packs, from an evolutionary point of view, speaking up against the crowd is extremely difficult. And if you've never had that experience of speaking up, that can be really hard to create an environment where that is safe for everyone. I'm really conscious. We've got one really quick question. What if leaders at any level don't really engage in the So what if leaders at any level don't really want to engage in the D&I space? We've got a minute to go.
I'm going to jump in really quickly.
Do it, Catherine.
I think, again, having a team member, someone in their team who feels safe to share their experience of the workplace from a lived experience perspective, that can often be way more powerful than presenting the business case. But there is a very strong case for inclusion at a time when we're seeing lowest levels of productivity in decades. Inclusive teams are 10 times more innovative, 8 times more collaborative and effectively collaborative, deliver 4 times better excellent customer service, and are 2.5 times more willing to go above and beyond. So if the kind of moral imperative social good isn't going to cut through with them, there's productivity gains to unlock through having an inclusive workplace.
Oh, beautifully said, Catherine. I'll also just let Courtney and Cherie, any final comments that either of you want to make today to close out this pretty honest conversation.
Courtney?
Thanks, Cherie. I would probably just say I'd be curious to understand what is the hesitancy, seeking to understand what's that reluctance. Is it just then a lack of confidence? Is it a lack of skill or a lack of will there? Is it the commercial implications? And so I think sometimes too it's important because it can be so frustrating, is not to make too many assumptions about why that reluctance exists and really understanding that. And I think Catherine is absolutely right. There are both great commercial arguments for supporting DEI and also that moral imperative, and it's just nice to be a good person. So I think also, seek to understand that and explore that a bit too, I would say as well.
Yeah. I'm really aligned there. I by default, I do have, I assume generosity of intent. So I'm a very curious human and I just want to explore the reluctance like Courtney spoke to. As long as it's explored and when you get to the crunch of it, it's feeling safe, because I have in 11 years had the experience of people in my workplace who are not safe and neurodivergent people in leadership roles. And you can only imagine that was just much exploring, so much curiosity, assumed generosity of intent every step of the way. But if we're still at a point where that person might be writing up written warnings for my ADHD is because they opened a laptop during a meeting, we're in dangerous territory due to that reluctance to learn. So I assume that by default, the intention v impact the intention is great. However, I do draw the line if there is a negative impact being made on my team. So that's where I sort of sweep in and go, uh-oh, this isn't great. Yeah.
What a way to finish. Just be kind. It's not workism. It's actually just being kind and creating this space that ideally we all want to live in, of respect and generosity. To our three incredible speakers, thank you for being willing to have a hard conversation today, and to not be afraid to speak out. I know there's been a couple of comments come through. We really value your insights and wisdom. We'll send a follow-up email for everyone and the recording as well. If you think someone would be interested in watching it, they can afterwards. So thank you all. To everyone, go on, go do amazing things, even if it's just a small thing today to create a more inclusive and diverse place. Thank you all. Bye.